Hello everyone, my name is Dylan Eustachi. Welcome to my final creative project in the form of this beautiful video essay. And today we're going to be talking about an extremely fun topic, war propaganda. Or more specifically, the figure that came before the well-known figures of Uncle Sam or Lady Liberty. Before both of them, there was a different mythic figure that personified what it meant to be the good, perfect American, the figure that will call our country to arms and fight for what's right. This figure was Columbia. However, figures like these are not commonly referenced in the American zeitgeist, so many of us have never even heard of Columbia. But really unpacking who she is, we gotta look at her physically. We're about to put our art history goggles on and look at the figure of Columbia from this war propaganda during World War II. Now, when you hear Columbus and good symbol of an American, obviously there's going to be a clash, and that's what we're going to be unpacking today. I'll be looking at the problematic use of the Columbia figure in war propaganda and how the repercussions of Columbus continue to affect our country long after his time. Let's get started. From a purely aesthetic standpoint, looking at this figure, the first thing the eye is drawn to is the American flag, being donned by a white woman in Greco-Roman style clothing. She is also holding a sword and has a army-looking cap with stars and stripes on it. The perfect personification of the United States. I mean, you can't miss it. Look how many flags are in this photo. But truly, one may look at this and think, well, yeah, they're trying to do patriotism. They're trying to rouse the nation to help fight. However, there is a much more complicated history when looking at the symbolism behind Columbia and truly the significance of her being a white woman dressed in Greco-Roman style clothing. The representation of America that this propaganda is trying to get across is that America is represented by Caucasianness. It's represented by the white. But really there is a lot more significance to her appearance than simply, oh, named after Columbia and it's a white figure. This is an obvious ruse at white nationalism. In fact, there was an entirely different personification of the United States before the symbol of Columbia. Of course, because there were people that existed in North America before Columbus discovered the continent. This was a figure that represented what this essayist calls the Indian princess. When looking at the symbol of the Indian princess compared to Columbia, the essay states, this quote, coupled with the simple viewing of that specific piece of propaganda, shows me that this isn't simply, let's make a new symbol for the United States that better fits what we all look like and want to personify as a nation. That this was a very specific and targeted look at how to create a new type of nationalism in the United States that better fit the Columbus-style ideology. The Indian princess personified an actual race of humankind who had first inhabited the continent, had symbolized the Western Hemisphere since the mid-16th century, and could represent the Caribbean peoples Columbus had encountered in 1492. Columbia was a symbol of newly created for the Republic. However, by the 1780s, there was an emergence of a new figure, that of Columbia. Not only did we replace the symbol of the Indian princess with a more Columbus-friendly version, but her being a woman specifically also has a lot of nuance when it comes to different world wars. Consequently, sexuality and nationalism are closely intertwined. To defend the nation-state is to shelter female bodies from rapacious enemies, and to retain the purity and structural integrity of the national borders and codes of law. This quote not only takes away any of the figurative language around Columbia personifying the United States, this openly states that she is the United States, having the female body and female sexuality representing the purity and structural integrity of this country, specifically using the idea of borders, which is extremely ironic in the case of looking at how Columbia replaced the Indian princess. Looking back on the figure, it is very, very similar to another famous painting that symbolizes manifest destiny. Very similar to the idea of there being a figure of the Indian princess that gets moved away, simply thrown out of the throes of history and replaced by another figure, a white figure. The symbol of Colombia is shockingly similar to the portrait of America in the painting American Progress by John Gast. This figure, who looks so eerily similar to Colombia, represents manifest destiny. Now, having the figure for the United States in war propaganda, not in 1492, but in the 1780s, all the way through World War II, happening in the 1940s, shows that this was a very intentional ploy to create a symbol of the United States that held up the idea of the propter nos. Now that we have talked about who Colombia is, where the insignia came from, and what she looks like, and its context with power structures, we will now be looking at her significance on soldiers, women, and manifest destiny as a whole. One thing that I wanted to point out is that many Americans wouldn't even consider the Columbia figure to be propaganda. The true significance within having the Columbia symbol being used not only as war propaganda in general, but during World War II, is the sheer hypocrisy of it. In fact, many people would not even consider the use of Columbia to be war propaganda, as most war posters were not seen as propaganda and still aren't in the popular American zeitgeist. When in reality, they are doing the exact same thing that has been commonly used in fascism by Benito Mussolini during the same war in which this figure was being spread across the United States. Ruth Ben-Ghiat talks about fascism and specifically about Mussolini and how he was able to rise as the nation's leader under fascism. Most importantly, stating the use of propaganda in creating the idea of the masses. This mobilized his political journey and really had the ideas of the government at center stage. This is the exact same thing that America did with the Columbia figure during World War II. The system of power in place with the Columbia figure in this particular piece of propaganda is that she is saying Columbia calls. She is calling out to the young men, and in the bottom corner there is a very small inscription of a poem, and it talks about maintaining the freedom. We have to maintain the freedom to keep America going. This is being spread out to everybody, not just in revolutionary times when the figure first became popular, but in the 1940s, when they are calling people of all races and nationalities to come fight for the American cause, to fight against fascism, while using the same exact methods as them. They are using their power to create the idea of the perfect American, effectively guilt-tripping all of the other people into joining the war. This symbol creates this notion of power that these are the type of people that are meant to inherit and keep this country safe. But so many Americans did not fall into that bracket. Therefore, the figure of Columbia is absolutely used as a piece of military propaganda in order to create a power dynamic that situates the white man once again back at the top of the pedestal, perpetuating the idea of the propter nos, while guilt-tripping everyone else into being called for war. While some may hear about the history of this controversial figure and think nothing of its connections to Columbus in 1492 itself, it holds a myriad of consequences. Most importantly, how this figure is supposed to represent the entire United States, even though it upholds the idea of the propter nos. The propter nos is the idea that the world is made for us. It's the very ideology that Columbus had when he came to North America and the subsequent islands of the Caribbean, which may sound like an innocent ideology. However, the us that is mentioned is white Christian men, groupings that did not exist in the countries that he voyaged to, with the symbol of Columbia upholding a more contemporary idea of the propter nos during these times of war. Looking at the piece of war propaganda from World War II, the mythic figure of the US calls these men to fight. However, if you are not one of those men who would traditionally feel represented by the figure of Columbia, then their formation of Columbia calls means something quite different. In fact, there are even more power dynamics at play with the simple semantics of the term Columbia calls. Looking at Columbia and its uses in history and, of course, in linguistics, it is very popularly used in a poem by Phillis Wheatley, an African poet and slave. And there's often shock and confusion as to why a woman in her position would revere the term Columbia. It is the power dynamics that the Propter Nos created. These are the people who made the history. These are the people who made the textbooks. Phillis Wheatley learned that this is what happened in history, that Columbus founded America, that revering him, revering Columbia. But that's simply because of the power dynamics. It's all she could have learned because it's all that was written. However, it is just another example of how power dynamics and linguistics play a role in this piece of propaganda. You can't just simply cart this off as, oh, it was for the military, it was to get people to join the war. It has the specific phrase Columbia calls. There is power behind that semantics. There is power behind those words. There's power behind the term Columbia, especially when looking at the connection to Columbus. In fact, the connections to Columbus go much further even than the name. As theorist Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz highlights the cult of Columbus and how the government and the nation have idolized him as a central figure in the founding of America for centuries. From this also came the Knights of Columbus, an organization founded by Catholic descendants of Columbus, figuratively, that were on a mission to create a society of Catholic virtue and, as Triot states, a citizen culture. The Knights of Columbus were revered for their ideology, the same ideology as Columbus, creating a community that represented the true Columbia. There is no difference here in the myth of Columbia being used during wartime propaganda and the idea in the myth of Columbus as a man, same ideology and power dynamics being used to subjugate people that were living in the United States that did not fit this larger idea of the Propter Nos. In conclusion, the figure of Columbia used in military propaganda changed after this war and was replaced with Lady Liberty and Uncle Sam. The idea of being an American was now consumed with the idea of immigration. Lady Liberty was a beacon for migrants in a new melting pot version of the United States, a version that is not directly linked to Columbus through semantics, further explicating how the power dynamics at play with the semantics of Columbia truly exemplifies Columbus's hold and effect on the nation in creating systems of class and racial differences when it comes to military propaganda and who they are trying to call to arms.